Hello and welcome to this video about running a workshop in the folk world especially. I'm Bob, I'm a caller. I've been calling for over 10 years now. I started in 2006 at Sheffield Ceilidh Soc and I call Ceilidhs, Playford and contradancing in the UK at festival level and all the way through to private parties and things. So a fairly broad brush. This video and the workshop, should you come to one of my workshops about this, is a bit more general. This is me thinking about how workshops in general could run, ways I think they could run, informed by my learning as a teacher. I teach secondary science, and this should be applicable across most workshops that you could think of running, actually. I've tried to keep this very general. This is not specifically about running dance workshops or anything like that. So first question to ask is, what's a workshop for? Well, I think there are a few things you might say here. You might say it's about education. It's teaching someone something, then learning something from it. About entertainment. People should have fun in a workshop, hopefully, maybe. Different people's fun can come in different ways. They might actually find a great deal of fun in doing something really detailed and in depth. They might want something a bit more surface level. And that's kind of my third one here, is experience. Those workshops that you go to just try something out. Your first Ceilidh workshop, try clog dancing, that sort of thing. And those are things I've thought of workshops being for. When I started thinking about it in a bit more detail, I think workshops tend to fall into what I would describe maybe pretentiously as 4 domains. Technical, so that's developing mechanical skill. That's a bit clunky. I haven't come up with a better way of saying that yet, but how to actually play the fiddle, how to actually do specific dance moves, things like that. Artistic, which is thinking about how you interpret things, how you perform things. Intonation, playing tunes nicely, thinking about different styles of tune or dance and how those go together. Repertoire is thinking about knowledge of tunes or dances or songs or stories and expanding that knowledge in terms of, I now know this dance, I now know that dance. As a folk dance caller, I find that a lot of specifically social dance workshops very much fall into this category. I feel like we are currently weighted a bit too far into repertoire workshops. We don't think so much about technical and artistic workshops in the way that I would personally quite like to see happen a bit more. And I know there are various pushes at various places to try and improve that. But doing a repertoire workshop is comfortable. It's relatively easy for a caller and it's safe. You run some dances, you talk to people about the dances and they go away, they've had a good time. I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with doing that, but I think it needs to be balanced with the other domains as well. And the final domain is experiential, and this is one I hadn't initially thought of, but we came to in the first time I ran this workshop at the InterVarsity Folk Dance Festival, IFDIF, in 2020, was those workshops that don't really fall into the first 3 are those experiential workshops, the surface level, do a clog dance, or try out playing the fiddle, or just beginner's guide to Playford. And those are really important. Those might be beginners workshops, but they are very much an overall feel rather than getting into the nitty-gritty so much as the other ones. And this isn't to say that any given workshop is going to be specifically one of these things. Lots of workshops take in multiple levels, and lots of people in the social folk dance world would say they're doing repertoire, but they're also focusing on technical or artistic skills. And that can be true, but it is harder to think about those things separately if you're not being very careful about it. Maybe think a bit about that later on, but thinking about those can help focus what we're talking about. To help me think through this workshop and to hopefully help other people about this, I developed this sheet, and I will link this sheet in the description of this video. It's designed to be printed A4 in the file I'll link, and it's based on something that has been devised in teaching called the 5-minute lesson plan, which is a way of thinking through your lessons before you deliver them and help you structure the lessons in a helpful way. So I came up with this 5-minute workshop plan. We'll go through each of these sections in turn. The idea is you maybe put a workshop title in straight away. I would advise maybe leaving that until you've worked through at least the first set of boxes there. And you put some quick notes into each of those things, and each of those things has a specific reason for being there to help you build your workshop and make sure your workshop is going to make sense by the time you get to the end of it. And once you've filled in the whole sheet, you look back at the sheet and you go, okay, this is a workshop I can deliver. At least that's the plan. So we start with picture. Big picture is about context for your workshop. Got to think, is this a standalone workshop? Is it just a one-off somewhere? More likely, it's part of a larger event. Is that larger event a folk dance festival where you are putting on this workshop for probably experienced dancers? There might be other contexts there that you need to think about. Is it a festival where mostly dancers will be? Is it a festival where people who haven't danced before are more likely to be coming to your workshop? Is it part of some event that is not actually a folk festival? For instance, is it part of a local general music festival? Is it an individual workshop, or is it part of a series of workshops over the course of a week? Those are two very different things. You might find if you're doing a series of workshops that you might want to do a planning sheet for the series and then specific sheets for each of the workshops to help you structure that. I'm not going to get into series workshops here. They're a different beast in many ways. And other workshops you need to work with or around. If you are, for instance, running one stream of Playford workshops and there's someone else running a different set of Playford workshops, you might want to liaise and see what's going on between the two of you. If you're running a set of workshops and someone else is running an evening dance that might want to feed off your workshop, it may well be very helpful to communicate with them. If you're one caller as part of a set of workshops, then you're going to need to liaise with everyone else running the other workshops to find out what they're doing and get a plan together. Maybe you need to avoid certain things because they're going to be someone else's territory. All those sorts of things. So start with the big picture. Where's this happening? Why is it happening? Then you need to think about your objective. And your objective is, what's your big overall goal? And you might find that you're going to be quite general here. You might be quite specific. This might depend on what your domain is that you're focusing on. And I would suggest you focus on one of them, and then you might find you pull something in from somewhere else. So you might be doing a technical workshop. You might be doing an artistic workshop, a repertoire workshop, experiential workshop. I think it's a good idea to pick one of those to be your focus and then pull in from others. So that's where you're going in terms of an overall idea. So perhaps I want people to be able to dance long ways Playford dances. That sort of statement. I would like people to be able to play this sort of ornamentation on the fiddle competently. I would like people to go away having experienced a fun, simple clog dance. Doesn't really worry too much about exactly what you're going to say there, but You can come back to these. That's the great thing. When I do this, I would write in pencil to start with. There's going to be a little bit of cycling between these things. Next box along that row is the hook. The hook is the reason that people would want to come to this workshop, would think it's important. It might be that they won't know what the hook is until they get to the workshop, but if you can't come up with something that you can write down here and say, this workshop is interesting or important because, you need to go back to your objective and rethink it, because if you can't think of a reason this is interesting, your participants certainly won't be able to understand it. So cycle back, go back to your objective, rethink that if you need to, come back to the hook until you can write something you are happy with, saying this is important because. This is important because the history of the dance is really key to the context. This is important because this is a key skill for sessioning. This is important because I think clog dancing is really fun. Could be any of those things. But you need to be able to articulate that hook. If you can't say it, go back, rethink. And then your outcome. This is different to your objective. Your outcome is, what does successfully achieving your goal in the workshop look like? And this needs to be nice and concrete. This is, at the end of the workshop, they will be able to play this tune, to do these specific figures. They will be able to dance 3 steps of a clog dance. They'll be able to sing these songs. They will have sung in 4-part harmony, whatever it is. But this is your concrete outcome, the output that your participants will go away saying, oh yes, I learned this at the end of the workshop. So now you've got your first row filled in. We've got an objective, a hook, and an outcome. So we've got the basic layout of what we're aiming for. The next row down are more detailed, and they might change your first row again, but they're now what you should be able to write out based on that. I couldn't fit everything on one level, of course, and some of these things, the interplay is complex. Level is a really tricky one, but is something you need to think about. So think about what level you're planning for, and in general, in the UK, in the folk scene, we're not massively good at this, I think. We don't like labelling our workshops. We like to think that everyone could come into any workshop a lot of the time. And I'm not sure that's very helpful. I at least like to think of my workshops as either being beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Whatever language you want to use there, that's probably not the best way of thinking of it. But those are the 3. Once you said, I'm aiming for this, just do a quick sanity check. Look at your objective and your outcome and go, does that make sense? I've said that these beginners are going to go away having learned that tune. Is that a sensible tune for beginners to learn? Is it reasonable that those beginners will go away knowing 4 clog steps? Maybe you need to adjust. Go back, come back, think about it. Maybe you want to upscale your workshop. Maybe it's an intermediate workshop instead of a beginner workshop. But think reasonably, think really hard about whether it is actually a reasonable outcome, because no one wants to go away from a workshop feeling like they're unsuccessful. So that's a really important thing to think about. Linked to that is a word I've nicked from teaching practice, which is differentiation. So this is really tricky, and it's something that I don't think even the teaching profession necessarily has a full grasp on properly, and there are lots of ways of interpreting this. And I've put Here Be Dragons on here for a reason. This is dangerous to play with in many ways, but it is really important as well. So you've got to think, will you adapt your workshop to who's there? And the answer generally should be yes. But how will you adapt it? Going up a level, from where you are is really tricky because it's very hard to judge that. And if you're running a beginner's workshop, you should really stick to your guns. Even if you've only got one beginner in the room, you should be running a beginner's workshop. You've billed it as a beginner's workshop. You have to be really careful of that. It should say in the program or wherever you've labeled it, this is a beginner's workshop. Anyone who walks through your workshop's door who is more advanced than a beginner, who sees that this is a beginner's workshop, should be willing to dial it down. The beginners are the most important thing there in the beginner's workshop for sure. If you alienate the beginners, you've lost. It's one of the few ways I would say a workshop has failed, is if beginners go away from it in a beginner context, not having been treated the way they need to be treated to keep them at least interested, and certainly if they're feeling defeated, that is definitely a problem. Thinking about going down is a lot safer. What extra support could you offer? Can you take more time over things? Can you add extra steps in? Thinking about going further is a useful thing to do, but actually doing that can be tricky. And it can be a great thing when you can take your workshop with you to that stretch, to that challenge. But you've got to look at the room and think, am I leaving anyone behind? Because that's what you don't want to be doing. So think very carefully about that one. Okay, we come on to some smaller boxes, smaller things. Style. There's lots of things here, and it very much depends on your workshop, what this might encompass. It might be the context of the dance. Is this contra, Playford, Ceilidh? It might be which instruments you're thinking about using, which instruments you're going to welcome, which ones you might get that you can accommodate but aren't the focus. It might be thinking about what musical form you're doing, and are you thinking about working in Val folk? Are you thinking of working Scottish, Irish, Welsh, English, specifically American or French Canadian, all sorts of things like that? Or are you focusing on jigs, reels, polkas? So all those sorts of things, the things that might inform how you teach and play or dance or whatever that you think would be useful to think about. And these might be points to specifically expose your participants to, or it might be something you have to think of. I've got labels on there that's specifically relevant at the moment in social folk dance. How are you going to label your participants if you need them? If you're doing couple work, are you using leads and follows? If you're doing Ceilidh contra Playford, are you using geographic calls, larks and ravens, gents and ladies, men and women, suns and moons? You need to know that before you do anything else in many ways, and that is a discussion to be had with your organisers. You should, if you've got to this point, know that already, I would hope. But if you don't know, now is a good time to find out. Make sure you are comfortable with the set of labels that you are going to be working with. Concepts. Now, this one might seem a bit like, but that should have come in earlier. And in many ways, yes, it should, but I'm also talking about the other key ideas. And it might not be the ones you necessarily think of, but this is a space to just dial back a bit and think what are the key concepts they need to know. If you're doing Ceilidh, they need to know that things tend to come in eighths. They need to know that they probably have a fixed partner. They need to know about progression and how that works. They might need to know about up and down. They might need to know specific figures, all those sorts of things. It's only a little box, but if you're overloading it, maybe you need to think about your workshop a bit more. But what are the key things you need to make sure they know? This might be things to check at the beginning of the workshop. It might be things you specifically want to address, but that's where those go. Then we've got timing, and timing kind of covers two sections here. There's how long have you got? How are you going to fit that in? And if you've got an hour-ish, typical workshop length, that's great. If you've got a really long, like the current morning slots at Sidmouth, that might be a challenge. Think about how you're going to structure that. If you've only got half an hour or 10 minutes, you've got to think about that and what you're going to do there. And then, so that's within your slot. Then outside your slot, you've got to think about what's on before you. Do you need to sound check after they've finished, if you're sound checking? Do you need to sound check before they've started? Are they likely to run late? What's coming after you? Do you need to get out off that stage or wherever you are bang on time? Do you have a bit of wiggle room? Try not to take that wiggle room. If you've been timetabled a certain amount of time, that's what you've got, but it's worth knowing. Is there something happening, and you might not know this, is there something happening halfway through your workshop that's going to suddenly slice half of your participants out of the workshop because they have something else they want to go to? Or are you suddenly going to discover that halfway through your workshop, the other two streams of workshops are finished, and you're going to suddenly have a whole load of enthusiastic but untrained people into your workshop for whatever it is? That's things that might be worth knowing. And then resources. What do you need? Is that printed handouts you need? Is that other people? Are you working with a partner for thinking about couple dancing? Do you have live music? Have you got musicians that you need to work with? All those sorts of things are things to put into resources. Do you need a set of melodians? Do you need rapper swords? Where are you going to source those from? All those sorts of bits and pieces need thinking about, thinking through. So worth getting those down and thinking ahead of time, I'm going to need these things. And at this stage, we've filled in 2/3 of this sheet, and we haven't really thought about teaching in the workshop yet. That's okay. We've done a whole load of preparation here. We're ready to start thinking about how we're actually going to deliver this workshop. Before we get there, I want to just mention something called cognitive load, which is a popular idea in teaching at the moment. And it's thinking about how much information people can deal with. Common studies say we can hold about 4 to 7 concepts or facts in our short-term memory before we start pushing things out. That's just our short-term memory. If we can slot them into something else, into what gets called a schema, a way of thinking, a mental map of some description, we can take in more information because we can just shunt those off to our longer term memory. So don't overload people here, is what I'm saying. Chunk it down, break it down, think about how many things you're asking them to hold in their memory at any one time. And think about things like, if I'm wanting to teach a figure, for instance, it can be very tempting to teach a whole dance to teach one figure. But does that make sense? Would it make more sense to get people to learn the figure first in isolation? Get some practice, get that into a bit more of their long-term memory. They've got the structure of the figure that they can then slot into a dance. That might make more sense. They might take in more of that than getting partway through the dance, learning a figure, and then they've either not been able to take in everything about the figure because they're trying to remember the dance, or they've now forgotten the first half of the dance again. And then you teach them the first half of the dance again and they've forgotten the figure. So try and help people understand how things fit together. That will help them with their cognitive load. That's why I'm not a fan of the sort of very quick verbal summaries that sometimes happen before dances, which mostly function more as a aid memoir for the caller, I think. As a dancer, I just want to know the first figure. I'm holding everything else in my schema. I'm then having this other verbal information dumped on me that I don't need to be thinking about. The caller will call during the dance and help me through that. So think about how much load you're putting on people's brains. And think particularly about this with beginners. Experienced dancers have a whole set of schema for slotting things into. They know what the sets are. They know how the tunes pan out generally. They know they don't need to worry too much about how the tune works in dancing, for instance. Beginners have got none of that structure. So thinking about how you build them a schema, a way of thinking about dancing from first principles without overloading them too much is a really helpful thing to think about. Only tell them the very basic information they need to know to start with. Get them to get that in, then you can start telling them more important extra bits. But think about how you're going to pace that, how you're going to scaffold them along. Okay, so now we're into actually thinking about a workshop. Now, I'm by no means suggesting here, if you look at the original sheet, I have a starter, I have 3 sections, and then I have a finisher. That bit in the middle, very flexible, just made sense to put 3 boxes there. But I think the start and the end are quite important. Your starter goes back to your hook and your objective. How are you going to get people in? Why should they stay? They've arrived at this workshop. Tell them why it's worth staying. Tell them what your objective is. What are you going to do? What's the plan? If you can you show the successful outcome? If you're an instrumentalist, maybe you can play them a tune and say, this is where we're going to. If you're doing an experiential workshop, hopefully you can just show them what they're going to do. If you're in a bigger workshop, more participants, social dance workshop, things like that, it can be more difficult, but you can at least tell people where you're aiming for. So that's your starter, getting going. You may wish to include a warm-up here. If you're doing social folk dance, you probably should, but we don't really do that very much, and we should think about that more, I think. If you're doing instrument workshops, maybe you should think about finger and arm warm-ups, things like that. Just get people into the flow of the workshop. Start gentle, get them used to being successful. Then we get into the main bulk of this. And like I said, 1, 2, 3, sure, fine. If you want to do 3 things, if you want to do 5 things, fine. Just think about your timing and what you're going to do. Got to think about here how you're getting from the start, meeting your participants where they are. If you're lucky, your leveling of the workshop meets exactly what you're expecting and what they're expecting. But if not, you may have to adapt. That differentiation comes in. Think about that. Think about other key phrases to use. Think about teaching people the right language straight away, if you can. Teach people right the first time, but break it down if you need to. Go think about halfway through probably, so that's when you need to be thinking about this. What can you drop? If you're running behind time, what things can you not say? What can you dodge round? What if you're going too fast? Do you have an extra thing to slot in if you need to? What can you stretch? Be careful of that. Careful of slotting an extra thing in. It's probably better to go back over something you've already covered, cover it in more detail, get people more confident with something, than to add a whole extra step or a whole nother dance in if you genuinely don't have time. Hopefully you've thought about this and you are keeping an eye on the time. You know how much time you've got and you can just stretch things a little bit extra, give people a little bit extra practice time, things like that, so they get that success rather than making them feel like they've not done something that they think you've planned to always do. And then, how do you know your teaching is working? This is a big question in teaching in general. Can get called assessment for learning. How do you know your learners are learning the thing you want them to learn? Now, isolated activities are actually easier to observe and keep tabs on than people doing a whole dance. So breaking things down into individual steps, individual figures can be quite good for this, because you can see that people are doing the specific thing that you're interested in rather than having the whole context. Of course, workshop size is a factor here. You could, if you're in a small workshop, get round all of your participants and see what they're doing. But it may well be that if you're in a big workshop, that's just not possible. It may be that you can judge it based on sound. If you're in a clog workshop, you can tell if you've got a decent amount of people in time. And if you haven't, then you know maybe you need to go back over that figure. Same for tune workshops. You can generally tell if something's chugging along nicely or if there's something dragging somewhere, that sort of thing. And you can see the visuals in a dance workshop. But you've got to think about this. How will you know? And how will you know at each stage? There's no point moving on to the next step of something if you don't think your participants have really grasped the first step. Maybe think about what you do if they haven't. And finally, the finisher, where you're ending up. How can your participants show their success? How can they know they've got where they're going? You're going back to your outcome and your objectives. If your finisher doesn't match your outcome, you've got a problem, because your finisher should be your outcome. If you haven't reached that planned objective, what do? What's your next step back? What can you do, even if you haven't got all the way? But I think it's a really good thing to send your participants off going, yes, we got to this stage, we could do that. And be very clear about where they could go from here, and if they didn't quite get to it, not feeling like they failed, but feeling like that was a stretch and that maybe next time they'll get that far. But they should go away going, I have learnt this thing. I think that's the most important thing, is thinking, have my participants gone away learning the thing I wanted them to do? Have they satisfied the objective and the outcome that I have set up for this? Have they succeeded? Because that's what we all want from our workshop participants, is success. That's really what we want. So hopefully that's a nice, sensible way of thinking through a workshop, and hopefully it will be useful to someone. Thank you very much.